The US is threatening to target the economies of countries that cooperate with Iran as part of what it calls an economic onslaught against the Iranian regime. Operation Economic Outcast represents a shift in American strategy as its war with Iran approaches the 6-month mark with no end in sight. Justin Woofers, welcome to the program.
Hey, Patricia.
The US promised economic D-Day for Iran, and Scott Bessent says this is the greatest global financial offensive ever. What does that mean for the sanctions?
Mate, it's very hard to tell. I mean, look, if this was an administration that always told the truth and never exaggerated, then I'd say it means what they said. Probably doesn't mean exactly that. Let me actually start by giving you a quote. It's a very interesting quote. It's from the Secretary of State of the United States, but in 1963. He said, "Our aim is to tighten the noose around the blank economy until that regime becomes a complete pariah." Do you want to fill in the blank for me?
I think it's pretty obvious what you're saying here. So they're
It was
trying...
Cuba. Right, it was Cuba. We still have those sanctions on. President Kennedy said, we're taking a lot of steps to try to isolate Castro, who we believe is eventually going to fall. In fact, Fidel Castro lived a very long life, passed the baton on to his brother Raul Castro, who then handpicked his successor, who is currently the leader of Cuba, more than 6 decades on.
So you're saying this is just going to become a protracted economic stranglehold?
Look, I'm just saying that's history, but the history does seem useful. Look, let me go back a step. I want to say something positive about it. If the way the US is going to prosecute its war with Iran is through economic sanctions rather than killing American young men and women and Iranian families, I'm all in favor of it. In fact, the Foreign Affairs Handbook says begin with economic sanctions before you start killing people. So after our 4 to 6 week war finally hits the 6-month period, we've decided to loop back and do the thing we should have done 2 weeks before the war started. Now, the problem, of course, is that the US already has sanctions on Iran. In fact, it's fully blockaded Iran. And so all of this is not about whether Americans do business with Iran, it's whether America uses its power to prevent anyone else from doing business with Iran. That would require the Americans to credibly commit that they would stop doing business with anyone who did business with Iran, which then means we're potentially talking about starting a trade war for anyone who decides they want to stand next to Iran rather than standing next to the United States.
The department said it had issued determinations against 5 sectors: digital assets, technology, gold, aviation and shipping. Why are these sectors important?
So one answer is they're the sectors where we don't have existing sanctions. What's going on here is, already the Iranians can't get ships in and out. And so now this is moving from physical space to trying to choke off a different set of pipelines. So to give you an analogy, the whole world has learned the importance of a particular part of the world, the Strait of Hormuz, a little area where you need to go to get a lot of the oil out. Think about that as sort of like a pipeline. So Iran controls important global oil pipelines. The United States controls really important financial pipelines. This is the SWIFT payment system. This is the US banking system. A lot of the world runs through US dollars and through US institutions. And the United States is effectively saying, you guys have got the Strait of Hormuz, you can shut off oil. The Americans are saying, we hold the global financial pipelines, we can cut you off financially.
Scott Bessent threatened what are called secondary sanctions on all nations that continued to do business with Iran. Which countries is he talking about?
Mate, I think that means everyone. And they want to cut off everything. So the Treasury hasn't been completely clear about this. It's been very clear about the American position. So if you're an Iranian family living in America and you want to send back money to help your family that is hungry and starving because of the collapse of the Iranian economy, that will be illegal. If you want to hold a friendly soccer match between the United States and Iran, that will be illegal. If you want to hold an academic conference where a bunch of nerds will debate the importance of the Iranian economy, you can't invite any Iranians. And so the whole point is that we're trying to shut off all forms of doing business, the Americans, with Iran, and they want every other country to line up. Now, will it go as far as to say Australians can't send money back to their Iranian families? That the Treasury Secretary has been completely unclear about. That's certainly the position for folks who are living in the United States.
Why hasn't the US employed these sanctions beforehand?
It has. The United States has something like 6,000 separate sanctions on Iran. It's had sanctions on Iran for decades.
But not this extent.
Right. But it's got most of the really economically important ones. At the moment, the blockade means effectively nothing's going in and nothing's going out overseas. So many of the sanctions have been there for decades. Some have been there for weeks. They're potentially adding several more. But look, the thumb screws are already really tight. This is talking about tightening them another wind or two. But really, I mean, sorry, to answer your question, Patricia, the United States went in and decided to do it with guns. And that 4 to 6 week war, we're now 6 months into it, that appears to have failed. The president's still not willing to put boots on the ground, so he's trying the only other leverage that he has, which is economic.
For this to work, it requires the cooperation of China, doesn't it?
So what already exists is the US doesn't do business with Iran. That works. What the US wants to do is persuade the rest of the world not to do business with Iran. The moment you get any defectors, say China, that says, you know what, we kind of like Iran, we're going to send them stuff, or we like money, we'll send stuff to Iran. If China or Russia decides to do that, then the US either has to declare a trade war against those countries or let them do that, in which case the Iranian sanctions won't do much. Again, by the way, this has a very strong parallel to the sanctions on Cuba. The Americans brought along many countries who also had sanctions against Cuba, but Cuba had a sponsor state being the former Soviet Union, and that kept their economy alive, and it limited the impact of those sanctions. And so a big question is, has the White House secretly gotten the Chinese and the Russians on board? Or alternatively, if it hasn't, is it actually willing to start trade wars with those countries in order to pressure them to step into line on this? We don't know the answer to either of those things. The Treasury Secretary was very clear today. I've talked to people all around the world, but I'm definitely not going to tell you who they are or what they promised to do.
Iran and its response will be key. Iran's economy minister says his nation has had a 2-year plan to counter measures like it. How could Iran counter it?
Well, so the obvious, Iran doesn't need to stick to an economic response. Iran could respond militarily and has already said that it will. So America tries to make life harder for Iranians, and Iran can and has already said that it will start to bomb American allies in the region, bomb American bases, make it difficult for ships of any other country to get through the Strait of Hormuz. So the Iranian response doesn't need to be economic, it could be military. And remember, Iran at the moment controls the Strait of Hormuz and possibly several other choke points in the region.
So where do you see this going then?
Let me answer that a roundabout way. I was struck today that financial markets were watching this very closely and yawned. That suggests that the reading of folks who are betting millions and billions of dollars on this is that this was another day in which the Trump White House announced strong measures that it may possibly follow through on, but has a long history of not fully following through on. It didn't see this as an easy or obvious resolution to difficulties in the oil market or difficulties with international trade or international relations. It sure as heck doesn't seem like the Iranians have said, oh no, you're doing economic D-Day, let's sit down and talk. And we do have a long history of troubles like this in countries like Cuba, but also countries like Iran, of these things just dragging out for decades and no president's ever willing to draw things to a close. And so we keep inflicting pain and they keep this. And by the way, to be clear, that's pain on the Iranian people, not on the leadership. And they feel pain, but when they're hungry, they choose not to overthrow their leader, but instead express anger at the folks who cut them off from global food markets.
Thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.